Okay, I see I am up on YouTube at the very least. And alright, the preview's just offline. Understood. But hello, everybody. It is good to stream again. I'm sorry I haven't done it in a while. Don't worry, I'll get music up soon. I have just been a little busy. I wanted to do art for this stream because I really want to make that. I really want to do this quite a bit. I've talked about it before. I should have done it before the Ryoshu Kanto. That is fault on my part, unfortunately. However, it is here. I have done all I can in preparation for this, aside from the music, which I will get to. And I'm going to read... Ever since I read Hellscreen for Limpus Company, I honestly kind of wanted to read more of his works. Not Ryunosuke. No, it is Ryunosuke Akutagawa. It was definitely an interesting tale. I will get to it, of course, eventually. But I'm going to be reading the book I have of a bunch of his short stories in order. So, at the very least, we're going to start with, I think it's Rashomon first. And, of course, I'm using the translations by Richard Medhurst, in case anyone wanted to know. So, let me switch over to... Ba-da-ba! We have actual art for this. Let me hide the chats first, because look at this. Look at how cute it is. Get all the mollies on it. I worked really hard on this. Even the Sakura petal was trying to... I hand drew them because I couldn't find a good way to get, like, a GIF form of them or, like, a green screened version on. So, I just studied and drew them to the best of my ability. I know it's only one row. I'm not skilled enough for it. So let me get to this first story. Yep, Rashomon. So let me reopen the chats and then get our... Also, yes, the petals are going in front of chat. I thought that would be a, really cute touch and whatnot. So let me get Soul of the Wind going here. And we shall begin. A servant waited under the Rashomon gate one evening for the rain to stop. Nobody else was taking shelter beneath its wide eaves, except a cricket perched on one of the great pillars from which the vermilion lacquer was peeling in places. Rashomon was on Suzaku Avenue, the main road through Kyoto, so one might have expected a few noblewomen in straw hats or courtiers with their soft caps to be waiting out the rain there, but right now there was only the servant. Kyoto had been beset by a series of disasters in the preceding few years: earthquakes, whirlwinds, fires, and famines. The capital was in perilous decline. Ancient records talk of how Buddhist statues and altar fittings were smashed up, and the wreckage, still bearing traces of lacquer and gold and silver foil, was stacked at the roadside and sold as firewood. With Kyoto in such a state, there was nobody to care about Rashomon's disrepair. Foxes and I have no clue why I'm messing this up so much. I am also going to turn this down a bit, just in case. Foxes and tanuki built their dens there, taking advantage of its dilapidation, and robbers stayed the night too. In the end, it became a dumping ground for corpses that had nobody to dispose of them. The eerie atmosphere after dark kept people at a distance. Also gotta make sure I don't want to skip any pages, of course. Instead of people, there were huge numbers of crows. In daytime, large groups would circle, cawing around the fishtail tiles that ornamented each end of the gate's roof. When the sky overhead reddened at sunset, they stood out like sprinkled sesame. The crows came to peck at the flesh of the dead in the upper story of the gate, but today, perhaps because it was late, there were none in sight. Only their white droppings stuck to the gate's stone steps, which were crumbling at the edges and sprouting weeds. In his faded robe, the servant sat on the highest of the 7 steps and looked vacantly at the rain falling, distracted by the large pimple on his right cheek. I wrote earlier that the servant was waiting for the rain to stop, but even if it did, he didn't have any particular goal in mind. Once he would have returned to the home of his master, but he'd been dismissed for 4 or 5 days before. Just as I said, Kyoto was in perilous decline. The fact that this servant's master, for whom he'd worked for many years, had decided he had no further use for him, was one small effect of this decay. So rather than describing him as waiting, it would be more fitting to say that the servant, driven here by the weather, was at his wit's end, with nowhere to go. And the sky that had a considerable influence on this Heian period servant's God, this is a weird one. Sentimentalisme. The rain that had started falling in late afternoon showed no sign of ceasing. The servant's main preoccupation was how he'd get through the following day. While considering how to deal with his impossible situation, however, his mind had wandered and he'd been listening for some time to the rain falling on Suzaku Avenue. The rain was falling harder now, enclosing Rashomon within its pelting clamor. The sky descended with the dusk, and when he looked up, the tiles jutting out at diagonals from the gate's roof seemed to be holding up the gloomy clouds. In such a bind, he couldn't be choosy about the lengths he'd go to. If he was squeamish, he'd end up starving against a wall or in the roadside mud, and then be carried here and flung away like a dog. If he really was ready to do anything, but this was as far as he would get. It was where his thoughts always ended after traveling back and forth along the same paths. While he understood that he must be ready to do anything, he lacked the courage to accept that his only remaining option was to become a thief. The servant sneezed explosively before rising warily to his feet. In Kyoto's evening chill, he yearned for a warm brazier. Like the darkness, the wind slipped freely between the pillars of the gate. By now, the cricket had disappeared from the peeling pillar. The servant drew his head down, hunched his shoulders under his blue robe and yellow undergarment, and looked around the gate. If there was a comfortable nook sheltered from rain and wind and out of sight of prying eyes, he'd spend the night there. He spotted a wide lacquered flight of steps leading to the story above. It was true there were people up there, but they were all dead. Taking care that his wooden hilted sword didn't slip from its scabbard, he trod on the first step with one straw sandal. It must have been some minutes later. Keeping his body low like a cat on one of the middle steps, the servant was holding his breath and peering upward. Torchlight from above faintly lit his right cheek, the one with the red, pus-filled pimple poking through his short beard. The servant had complacently believed that only the dead were upstairs, but then he'd seen that someone was carrying a light around. This was clear from the swaying, murky yellow illumination of the cobwebbed corners of the space under the roof. No ordinary person would be up there with a light on a rainy night like this. The servant crept like a lizard to the top step of the steep flight. Remaining as low as possible, he craned his head forward and peeked into the upper story. Corpses were scattered around inside, just as he'd heard, but the lit-up area was smaller than he'd thought, so he couldn't see how many. Yet in the dim light, he observed that some of the corpses were naked and others were clothed. Women and men were mixed together, lying with their mouths open or arms outstretched along the floor, like figures made from kneaded earth. It didn't seem possible that they'd all been living humans. What light there was lingered on the uppermost shoulders and chests, leaving lower parts in shadows, while the bodies kept the silence of those eternally incapable of speech. At first, the servant covered his nose at the stench coming from the corpses, but the next moment he forgot to do so, his sense of smell stolen away by astonishment. He saw a figure crouching among the bodies, short, thin, and white-haired. It was an old woman, simian in appearance, wearing a dark brown robe. She held a burning piece of pine wood in her right hand and was examining the face of a corpse. From the length of the hair, the corpse probably belonged to a woman. Okay, that's interesting, but alright. Seized by a mixture of 6 parts terror and 4 parts curiosity, the servant forgot to breathe for some moments. In the words of an ancient chronicler, all the hairs of his head and body stood on end. The woman prompted the piece of pine wood between the floorboards, brought both hands towards the head she'd been scrutinizing, and pulled out the long hairs one at a time, just like a monkey plucking lice from its young. The hair seemed to come out effortlessly. As he observed these actions, the fear ebbed by stages from the servant's heart. At the same time, a violent loathing for the old woman swelled up within him. Yet it would be misleading to say that it was directed at her. It was a revulsion for all forms of evil, growing by the minute. If someone had asked him right then the question he'd pondered below the gate, whether to starve or live as a thief, he'd probably have chosen starvation without a moment's regret. This was how much his heart burned, just like the pine wood stuck in the floorboards, with repulsion for wickedness. Of course, the servant didn't know why the old woman was removing the hair from a corpse. In a rational sense, he didn't know whether it was right to classify the act as good or wicked. And yet he considered on this rainy night on the upper floor of Rashomon that to pull hair from the dead was already an unforgivable sin. By now, he'd entirely forgotten his own inclination to become a thief. The servant sprang up from the steps and put one hand on his sword as he strode over to the old woman. Thunderstruck, she rose like she'd been fired from a slingshot. "You, where are you going?" the servant yelled, preventing her from making a frantic, stumbling escape over the bodies. She tried to push past him, but he thrust her back again. For some moments they grappled in silence, but the outcome was never in doubt. In the end, the servant gripped the woman's arms, all skin and bone like a chicken's feet, and pulled her to the ground. "What were you doing? Tell me, or you'll be for it." The servant shoved the woman away and drew his sword from its scabbard, flashing the bright steel in front of her eyes. But she said nothing, her hands trembling, her shoulders shaking as she gasped for breath, and her eyes opened so wide they seemed ready to leap from their sockets. She remained stubbornly silent. It was then that the servant had the first clear realization that the woman's life was in his power. This cooled the burning hatred in his heart, leaving only the quiet pride and satisfaction after a task is smoothly completed. The servant looked down at the old woman and softened his voice. "I'm not from the police office, just a traveler who was passing under the gate. So I'm not going to tie a rope around you and take you to be punished. You just have to tell me what you've been doing up here." The woman's eyes opened even wider, and she stared at the servant from under her red eyelids with the sharp gaze of a predatory bird. Her lips, almost connected to her nose by a mass of wrinkles, moved like she was chewing, and her Adam's apple made a visible motion in her scrawny throat. Then a gasping like a crow emerged to reach the servant's ears. I took the hair because I want to make a wig." The servant was let down by the unexpectedly humdrum nature of her reply. At this moment, his former loathing entered his heart, together with a cold contempt which seemed to convey itself to the woman. Still holding in one hand the hair she'd taken from the head of one of the corpses, she croaked like a toad, hesitating as she continued. "Perhaps there's something wrong about taking the hair from corpses, but all the dead people here were the kind to deserve it more or less. This woman whose hair I'm taking now made her living by chopping up snakes, drying them, and selling them as fish to the crown prince's guards at the guard room. If she hadn't got the pestilence and died, she'd still be selling them now. And that fish of hers tasted good, so the guards would always buy some for their meals. I don't think what she did was bad. It was just what she had to stop herself from starving. And so I don't think what I'm doing is bad either. It's just what I have to do to stop myself from starving. And this woman would well understand that and probably forgive me." The servant returned his sword to its scabbard, his left hand remaining on the hilt as he coolly listened. His right hand was occupied with the pus-filled pimple on his cheek. As he heard the woman speak, a sort of courage was born in his heart. The kind he'd lacked beneath the gate, quite different from the kind he'd had when he first came to this upper floor and seized the old woman. It wasn't only that he was no longer torn between whether to starve or become a thief. The thought of starvation had been thrust so far out of his thinking that he almost couldn't imagine it. She would she? The servant mocked. Then he took a step forward, his right hand shooting away from the pimple to grab the woman by the scruff of her neck as he snapped. Then you won't begrudge it if I take your clothes, because if I don't, then I'll starve. With that, he tore off the woman's robe, and as she tried to cling to his feet, he kicked her in among the corpses. 5 paces later, he reached the top of the steps, and, tucking the robe under his arm, he dashed down the steep flight into the depths of the night. The woman lay for some moments, as if she too were one of the dead. Then she lifted her naked body from the corpses, muttering and moaning as she crawled over to the top of the steps by the still burning light of the torch. Her short white hair hung down as she looked below the gate. All that was outside was the inky blackness of night. Nobody knows where the servant went. And that's it. Honestly, pretty short for it. I feel like even shorter than Hellscream, because that had like actual chapters to it. This was what? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 pages long. And it's all about just the choice between starvation or doing things that people might consider wicked. And honestly, what a strange ending of him just finally giving in and realizing that even he isn't above reproach. Well, that's Rashomon. Next one is the nose. Because nobody knows about the nose. She wants to sell it. I thought she wanted to wig. I thought so too, but no. Definitely seems like she was going to sell it. Because, you know, she doesn't want to starve either. I'm trying to get OBS back open so I can see both chats. Alright, the nose. And we're already starting off with a name that's going to be annoying for me. Fun. Zenchi Naigu's nose was notorious in Ike-no-o. Some 6 inches in length, it dangled down over his upper lip to his chin, as thick as at the tip as it was at the base. It was like he had a sausage hanging from the middle of his face. Now over 50 and a Naigu senior priest in the palace sanctuary, he'd fretted in secret about his nose since he was a novice. On the surface, he still pretended it didn't greatly bother him. This wasn't so much because, as a priest who should be yearning for the next life's pure land, he considered it an improper subject of concern. It was more that he hated anyone to know he worried about his nose. Above all, he dreaded the appearance of the word nose in daily conversation. Yeah, fascinatingly, the American movie The Rashomon Effect is a different one of Akutagawa's stories. Interesting. Eventually, I'm probably going to get to it, because I'm just going to read this entire book eventually. I just started with that one because it was the first one. There were 2 reasons Zenchi considered his nose to be a nuisance. One was its inconvenient length. If he ate by himself, the tip would land in the rice in his metal bowl. So he had to have a young disciple sit on the other side of the table and hold it up with a wooden board an inch wide and 2 feet long. This wasn't an easy matter for either the disciple gripping the board or for Zenchi himself. Once, a page substituting for the disciple had sneezed, and his shuddering hands sent the nose plunging into the gruel. This anecdote had spread as far as Kyoto, which apparently in the last story is not doing so great. Even so, the inconvenience wasn't the primary cause for Zenchi's suffering. It was the injury to his self-respect. People in Ike-no-o said that it was fortunate, given his nose, that Zenchi was a priest, convinced that no woman would ever wish to marry him. Some suggested that this was even the reason why he'd taken the tonsure. But Zenchi didn't believe that his priestly status had lessened his nose-related troubles in the slightest, and his self-respect was entirely too delicate to be swayed by worldly matters, like whether he was married or not. Thus, Zenchi made efforts, both active and passive, to repair the damage to his dignity. Good for you, Zenchi. His first plan was to make the nose appear shorter than it was. When nobody was around, he'd rack his brains to figure out a way to achieve this, as he observed his face from different angles in the mirror. Not content with just moving his face, he tried resting his cheek on his hand or placing one finger on the end of his chin. But he never once perceived his nose as acceptably shorter. There were times when the more he had endeavored, the longer it appeared. Nose so true. At these moments, he'd pack the mirror away in its box, sigh, and return unwillingly to the low desk to read the Kanen Sutra. Or the Kanen Sutra. Hard to tell. He was obsessed by other people's noses. The temple at Ikinoo regularly held meals for priests and various kinds of lectures. There were extensive quarters where visiting priests could stay, and the temple's own holy men boiled up water in the bathhouse on a daily basis, meaning that great numbers of priests and laymen were always passing through. Zenshi scrutinized the faces of those who did, hoping to gain some ease by spotting just one person with a nose like his own. He was indifferent to blue robes or white kimonos, and so used to orange caps and dark gray vestments, he didn't even notice them. Zenshi saw noses rather than people, but even if he observed some hooked ones, there were none like his. As this experience repeated itself, his displeasure grew. If in conversation he sometimes gripped the tip of his nose unconsciously and examined it, and then blushed out all of keeping with his years, it was entirely down to this fixation. Zenshi had even imagined that if he could dig up someone with the same kind of nose in Buddhist or other texts, this would be of some comfort to him. Yet, none of the scriptures mentioned if the disciples Maudgalayayana or Sariputra had long noses, while the bodhisattvas Nagarjuna and Asvaghosa had typical human ones. I'm butchering these names, I'm sorry. When Zenshi found in a story of China that Liu Bei, an emperor of Shu Han, had long ears, he could only think, I'd feel much better if it was his nose. I need hardly add that alongside his passive suffering, Zenshi made active efforts to shrink his nose. In fact, he did all he could in this direction. He'd boiled and drunk snake gourd, for instance, and rubbed rat urine on his nose. But whatever he did, it kept hanging down over his lips in all its unwieldy length. Jeez, dude, at some point I think you just have to give up and accept it. One autumn, one of his disciples went on a trip to Kyoto, where he heard from a doctor friend about a method for reducing long noses. The doctor had come from China and was now a priest at Chorakuji Temple. Zenshi put on his customary show of indifference and at first expressed no interest in trying the method. Instead, at every meal he commented in passing on the trouble his disciple had taken to learn about it. In his heart, he was waiting to be persuaded, and the disciple knew what the Naigu was doing, but rather than getting antagonized, he was all the more sympathetic that he felt he had to deploy such an approach. As Zenshi had anticipated, he used all the arguments he could to recommend the method, and Zenshi himself bent an ear to the fervent counsel, as he had also anticipated. This treatment was simplicity itself. All that was required was to boil the nose and have someone tread on it. Alright, sure, why not? Heated water could be found in the temple bathhouse every day. The disciple filled a pot there with water so piping hot that he couldn't even dip a finger in it, and brought it over. Canto 9, but it's instead about Ryoshu really wanting a nose job. So true. Honestly, the more I hear about this guy's nose, the more I picture the big guy who's looking at the old painting. You know which one, the like giant guy with like huge head, but like I think he has a cane when he's sitting, and you get the ego gift where it's like heal 12% at the encounter start. I just picture that guy for this. But he worried that inserting the nose directly into the vessel would scald Zenshi's face with steam, so he made a hole in a wooden tray and used this as a lid, passing the nose through the hole into the water. With only the nose immersed, it didn't feel hot at all. Homeward painting? Yeah, that one. After a while, the disciple said, "It's well cooked now, master." With a forced smile, Zenji reflected that anyone listening would never think he was talking about a nose. The boiled nose was itchy, like it had been bitten by fleas. It was still steaming when Zenji removed it from the hole in the tray, and the disciple began stamping on it. Zenji lay on his side, with his nose laid out on the floor, watching as the disciple's feet moved up and down in front of his eyes. The disciple would sometimes lower his eyes to Zenchi's bald head with an apologetic expression and say, "I hope it doesn't hurt, master. The doctor said I had to tread on it, but I hope it doesn't hurt." Zenchi wanted to shake his head to convey that it didn't hurt, but this was a difficult task when his nose was being trampled. So looking upward at the cracks in the disciple's feet, he replied in an angry voice, "It doesn't hurt." The stamping on the itchy parts of his nose was actually rather pleasant. After the treading had gone on for a while, some tiny bumps like millet grains began to appear on the nose, which looked by now like a small plucked and roasted bird. Noticing this, the disciple stopped stamping and muttered to himself. He said next to pluck them out with tweezers. Zenji puffed his cheeks in discontent and waited in silence for the disciple to do whatever he needed. Of course he knew the man was kind, but he didn't appreciate having his nose treated like some inanimate object. With the look of a patient who doesn't trust the doctor operating on him, he watched the disciple wield the tweezers to pull pieces of fat from the pores of his nose, each one shaped like the shaft of a bird's feather and half an inch in length. After the process was finished, the disciple looked relieved, commenting, "We just need to boil it again." Zenji submitted to these words, his brows knitted in dissatisfaction. After its second boiling, Zenchi's nose was certainly shorter. Now it was no different than any ordinary hooked variety. Stroking this shorter version, he peeled awkwardly at the disciple's proffered mirror. Okay. The nose that once dangled down to his chin had shrunk miraculously, clinging on to its diminished life by halting timidly above the upper lip. Its various red patches were presumably the traces of the trampling it had received. But surely nobody would mock it now. Zenchi's face in the mirror regarded his face outside the mirror, eyes blinking in satisfaction. Yeah, definitely a big ew. On that first day, however, he still worried that his nose might spring out again to its former prominence. Curse my brain sometimes. Whether chanting sutras or at a meal, in any spare moment, he'd reach out a hand to brush discreetly against its tip. But he nose reaction. But he found each time that it was behaving itself, settled above his lips and showing no inclination to descend any further. When he woke early the next morning, the first thing Zenchi did was to caress his nose. It was as short as before. I can't get it out of my head now. The stupid nose erection. It was as short as before. He hadn't felt an ease like this since that many years ago when he'd accomplished the worthy task of copying out the Lotus Sutra by hand. Over the next few days, however, Zenji discovered an unexpected truth. The samurai who would sometimes come to Ikinoo Temple on business smirked more than he ever did before, and stared at his nose while barely saying a word. The temple page who'd previously dropped his nose in the gruel initially gazed at the ground to keep his hilarity in check when they passed each other outside the lecture hall, but lost control later, bursting into fits of laughter. And while the lower-ranked priests listened humbly enough when they were face to face, they might start chuckling the moment he turned away. This happened more than once or twice. At first, Zenchi interpreted such behavior as a result of the alteration in his face, but this seemed insufficient as an explanation. Of course, it was the reason for the amusement of the page and the subordinate priests, but even if they still reacted with laughter, as they had when his nose was long, there was a subtle difference. Perhaps the unfamiliarity of the short nose made it more ridiculous than the familiar long one. There was more to it than that, though. They didn't mock so blatantly before, since he would sometimes pause while reciting a sutra, tilt his bald head, and make such a comment to himself. At these moments, the old fellow's gaze was sure to drift over to the portrait of a bodhisattva. I'm trying to read this in my head, and my brain is just not comprehending the name. Samantabhadra. Beside him, as he recalled his long nose of 4 or 5 days earlier, brooding. I'm like a man who's ruined, looking back on past glories. Unfortunately, Zenshi lacked the insight to discover a solution to his problem. Each human heart has 2 contradictory impulses. Everyone feels sympathy for another's misfortunes, of course, but it's somehow disappointing if that person manages to overcome them. It might not be exaggerating to say there may even be a wish to see the other plunge back into the same troubles. At some point, if only unconsciously, one feels hostility towards the person. Although Zenshi couldn't grasp the reason, his discomfort derived from his sensing this kind of attitude of self-centered observation from the priests and laymen of Ikinoo. As Zenshi's spirits deteriorated day by day, he was constantly castigating everyone around him. In the end, even the disciple who'd performed the treatment on his nose began grumbling behind his back that he was sinning by spending all his time scolding them instead of teaching them the holy law. But it was the mischievous page who'd particularly enraged Zenshi. One day, the clamor of a dog barking led Zenshi to come out and see what was going on. He found the page swinging along a wooden board and racing after a thin, shaggy hound. As the page dashed after it, he mocked, "Don't let me hit your nose, don't let me hit your nose." Zenshi snatched the board from the page's hand and dealt him a blow to his face. It was the same plank previously used for holding up his nose. Zenshi grew bitter about the rash decision to shorten his nose. Then, one night, when the wind started up soon after sunset, the chiming of the pagoda's wind bells plagued him at his pillow. With the cold, too, Zenshi, who was getting on in years, couldn't fall asleep. As he lay awake in the middle of the floor, he felt his nose begin to itch. When he touched it with his hand, it was somewhat swollen, as if from dropsy. And this part of his body alone was hot. Making it so short might have caused some ailment, Zenshi muttered as he held his nose in the same reverent manner as he would offer up incense and flowers. The next morning, Zenshi woke early as usual to find the temple grounds covered in gold, as the ginkgo and horse chestnut trees had shed their leaves overnight. New frost had formed on the pagoda roof, and the 9-ringed vertical shaft that extended skyward from its top glittered in the faint morning sun. Zenshi stood on the veranda, where the shutters had been lifted, and took a deep breath. It was then that he felt an almost forgotten sensation. He lifted a hasty hand to his nose, which wasn't in its abbreviated form of the night before. Instead, it was the 6-inch nose that dangled down from his upper lip to his chin. He realized that it had returned to its original length overnight. At the same time, he felt untroubled again, as he had when his nose first became shorter. Now surely nobody will mock it, Zenshi thought to himself as the nose dangled in the dawn's autumn breeze. And that is just the end of it. Man shortens his nose, gets mocked, and then it just comes back. I curse you, Akutagawa, for making me read all of those bodhisattva names, honestly. That was annoying, to say the least. I feel bad for him, same, but honestly I'm glad his nose returned, because now he doesn't have to feel, completely awful about it. And yeah, always a nice story where it's like someone does something to try to make themselves happier, makes them worse, and then they just get to be happy again because it reverts. Such a shame that all those people at the temple/pagoda were just kind of jerks after a bit, though. Like, what the heck? Man clearly has body issues, and you're just like, let's just mock him. Just screw it. Anyways, I'm gonna step away for a tiny bit because I honestly want to just get water. My throat feels like it just is getting dry. My lips keep messing up, so I hope having water in it will be fine. And I'll be back. I will return with the next story, of course. So, Just watch the cute animation. I'm back. Unfortunately, room temperature water kind of doesn't exist in my sink. It's just forever cold immediately. I don't know why. And I don't want to have to wait minutes for it to warm up. So I'll just hope that it was close enough. But gonna pick us up with the liquor worm. And already I see this is going to be a multi-chapter one at the very least, instead of the other two, which are just straightforward stories. They sound like ice cold is helpful. Ayo. It was a heat unknown in recent years. Tiled roofs in every direction reflected the sun's rays with the dullness of lead, and one could imagine that the chicks and eggs in the swallows' nests underneath were steaming to death. Liquor or liquor? Liquor like the drink. In what passed for fields, the hemp and millet hung limply as warmth rose from the earth, and nothing was green or unfaded. The sky showed effects of the sultriness too. It was murky in its lower reaches despite the fine weather, and clouds with tops like pieces of roasted mochi rose up in clumps. The story of the liquor worm begins with 3 men out in a threshing field in the blazing heat. One lay naked, face upward on the ground. His hands and feet were bound with cord, but this didn't seem to pain him. He was short, ruddy, somehow stolid seeming, and fat like a pig. A simple ceramic jar was placed beside him, but what it contained was a mystery. Clearly it just contains 20% more cost. Another wore yellow robes and had a small bronze loop hanging from one ear. He looked like an odd, old-fashioned, itinerant priest. From the darkness of his skin and the curls in his hair and beard, he appeared to have come from beyond the western mountains. At first, he doggedly flapped a vermilion-handled fly whisk, driving off the horseflies and other buzzing insects that swarmed around the naked man. But, weary now, he came to squat like a self-important turkey beside the ceramic jar. The third man was some considerable distance from the other two, standing beneath the eaves of a thatched hut in the corner of the field. He had a rat-tail apology for a beard and a black robe long enough to cover his feet. Around his waist he wore a loosely knotted reddish-brown belt. From his careful, occasional use of a white feather fan, he seems to have been a Confucian. All 3 men were silent. as if by prior agreement. They moved very little, seeming to hold their breath, intent on something that was shortly to occur. It was just about noon. Perhaps the dogs were napping, as there was no sound of barking. The young leaves of the hemp and millet surrounding the threshing field shone quietly in the sun. Hot air drifted in the sweltering sky, and even the mountain-like clouds seemed to struggle for breath in the dryness. The only breathing creatures were the three men, who were silent as the clay figurines at the Guan Yu temple. This isn't a story from Japan, of course. It's about what happened one summer in Liu's threshing field in Changshan, China. Thanks, Ryunosuke Kutagawa. Chapter 2. The man lying naked was Liu Dasheng, the owner of the threshing field and one of the wealthiest men in Changshan. He was so dissipated, he drank almost continuously from morning onward. And he'd knock back an extraordinary amount, a great earthenware pot by himself alone. Yet, as is written, he owned 300 mu of fertile fields by the city walls. No, honey, I'm not flirting with a Chinese lesbian. Ryunosuke was the original, the OG. Half of which were planted with millet, so there was no way he could booze his way through his whole fortune. As to why he was lying there naked in the heat, that day he'd been with his drinking companion, Sun, the Confucian with the feather fan. Both men were leaning on the cool pillows known as bamboo wives in an airy room and competing at Go, when a maid came in. A priest says he's come from the Baozhuang temple, and he'd greatly like to meet you, she said. So what would you like me to do? What? The Baozhuang temple? Liu blinked his small eyes in the brightness. Then, lifting his heated, heavy body, he said, "Show him through." Looking at Sun, he added, "It's probably that priest." The Baozhuang temple priest was a foreigner from beyond China's borders to the west. He had won a great reputation in the area for his powers, both healing and aphrodisiac. There were all kinds of rumors of near miracles, like his rapid cures of one person's black cataract and another's swelling. The two men had heard such stories, but why had the foreign priest come to visit Liu today? He had no recollection of inviting him. I mean, the man's just inviting himself over. Wants to come to this bachelor pad, apparently. I'll note beforehand that Liu wasn't the kind of man who welcomed visitors, but when he had a guest, if another arrived, he'd generally greet that second person with pleasure. This was because he had a childish vanity in introducing his guests to others. At this time, the foreign priest was regarded as having a high status and certainly wasn't a guest to be ashamed of. This was why he'd said he'd meet him. I wonder what he wants. First, he'll ask you to give him alms or something. After this exchange, the maid brought in the odd-looking priest, who was tall with eyes like violet gemstones. He wore a yellow robe, and his curly hair fell conspicuously to his shoulders. Vermilion fly-whisk in hand, he stood impassively in the center of the room. He didn't speak at all, not even a greeting. Liu hesitated until he felt uneasy. "What's your reason for coming here?" he asked. The priest replied, "It's you, isn't it? The man who loves to drink?" Well, the question was so abrupt, Liu responded ambiguously and looked to Sun for rescue. Sun placed a stone on the go board, as if the matter was nothing to do with him. "You're suffering from a rare disease, did you know that?" The priest stressed his words. "You're an alcoholic." Liu stroked the bamboo wife, looking puzzled. "Disease? That's right. No, since I was a very small boy," Liu started to speak, but the priest cut him off. "You drink, but you don't get drunk." Speechless, Liu stared at the other man. It was true that he could knock back any amount of alcohol, but he'd never been intoxicated. "This is evidence of the disease," the priest smiled faintly. "You have a liquor worm in your stomach. If you don't remove it, you'll never be cured. I've come in all humility to heal you." "And will you cure it?" Liu said, and then felt ashamed of himself. "This is the very reason I've come here." Silent until then, Sun interjected, "Have you prepared some kind of medicine?" "There's no need for medicine," the priest responded curtly. The Confucianist Sun had an unreasonable contempt for Taoism and Buddhism, so even when he was with practitioners, he rarely conversed with them. What made him speak up on this occasion was his fascination with the word liquor worm, and a faint unease that, as he himself was a drinker, perhaps he might also harbor such a creature inside him. But the grudging response from the priest made Sun feel he had been made a fool of, and with a frown, he returned to placing ghost stones in silence. At the same time, he decided that Liu was ridiculous to meet with this insolent fellow. Indifferent to Sun's feelings, Liu asked, "So do you use needles?" "It's much simpler than that." "An incantation, then?" "It's not an incantation." Then the priest revealed the nature of the cure. All Liu had to do was to lie naked in the sun without moving. Liu thought that it sounded extremely easy. If that was all it was, he'd be better off doing it. And though he didn't realize it, he was partly moved by curiosity. God, this is the easiest remedy ever, apparently. Thus, Liu bowed at last. "Very well, I'll receive the treatment," he said. This was how he ended up naked in the blazing heat in the threshing field. The priest said that he mustn't move, which was why he tied Liu up. Then he called a young servant to prepare a ceramic jar with liquor and place it beside his master. Under the circumstances, it was only natural that Liu's partner in inebriation, Sun, should be present at this curious cure. Only the priest knew what kind of beast the liquor worm was, what would happen when it left Liu's stomach, and what the jar of drink was for. Liu may appear quite reckless for having submitted to the cure in ignorance, but ordinary people who get educated at schools are doing much the same kind of thing. Lying out with his nose erection out. No. He's just going commando with his Chinese best friend and his bamboo wife. Chapter 3. It was scorching. Sweat oozed from Liu's forehead, accumulating first into droplets and then flowing in tepid rivulets into his eyes. Because he was bound, he couldn't reach a hand to wipe it away. When he tried moving his head to alter the flow, he grew violently dizzy and gave up the plan. But the sweat paid no heed, wetting his eyelids, circling the sides of his nose and mouth, and running down beneath his jaw. It was immensely unpleasant. At first, he'd kept his eyes open, gazing at the burnt, white sky and fields of drooping hemp, but the indiscriminate streams of sweat had forced him to give even that up. Liu understood for the first time how much it could sting when sweat entered the eyes. I know that pain so well, just because of tennis and stuff like that. With a face like a sheep in a slaughterhouse, meekly closing his eyes, he felt the pain rising over all those parts of his skin that were facing upward. The burning anguish working its way across his skin, which had no form of resistance, was far beyond the suffering caused by the sweating. Liu began to feel enraged that he had chosen to receive the priest's treatment. Yet, from a later perspective, this was still the relatively painless period. Liu's throat was dry. He remembered the story of how Cao Cao, or some such ancient leader, had slaked the thrills of his soldiers by assuring them there was a plum grove up ahead. Still, no matter how hard he endeavored to summon up the fruit's sweet and sour taste, his throat remained as parched as ever. He tried moving his jaw and biting his tongue, but his thirst persisted. His suffering would have been easier to bear without the ceramic jar beside him and the heat and the heady aroma of the liquor constantly assaulting his nostrils. Was it his imagination that the smell was getting stronger by the moment? Liu opened his eyes so that he could at least look at the jar. His gaze fell on its mouth and half of its rounded body. That was all he could actually see, but he pictured the golden liquid in the dimness inside, filling the jar to the brim. Unthinking, he licked his cracked lips with his dry tongue, but no saliva emerged. Even his sweat wasn't flowing like before. He went through 2 or 3 more spells of violent dizziness. His head was constantly aching. Liu's hatred of the priest intensified, and he wondered why he'd allowed himself to be deceived into undergoing this foolish hardship. His throat became even drier, and there was a strange nausea in his chest. He couldn't stand it anymore. Finally, he opened his mouth, gasping for air, with the intention of asking the waiting priest to stop the treatment. At that moment, he felt an unfamiliar mass rising from his chest into his throat a little at a time. Sometimes it felt as though it was creeping like a worm, and other times it seemed to be crawling like a lizard. In any case, something soft was making slow progress up his throat. Having finally slipped over his Adam's apple, it suddenly leaped like a fish into the outside world. Something splashed into the liquor of the ceramic jar. The priest jumped up from where he'd been squatting and loosed Liu from his bonds. "Calm yourself," he said. "The liquor worm has left your body." "Has it really left?" Liu groaned, lifting his giddy head and forgetting his unbearable thirst at the strangeness of it all. He crawled toward the jar, still naked. Sun, who'd been observing, hurried over, shielding himself from the fierce rays with his white feather fan. All three men looked into the jar, where a small salamander-like creature with flesh the color of red clay was swimming in the liquor. It must have been 4 inches in length. It had a mouth and eyes and seemed to be drinking the liquor as it swam. Watching it, Liu felt nausea overtake him. Chapter 4. The efficacy of the priest's cure was immediately apparent. From that day on, Liu Dasheng never touched a drop of alcohol, and even the smell is abhorrent to him now. Yet his health gradually deteriorated. 3 years have passed since he spat up the liquor worm, and he has none of the plumpness of former times. His ill-complexioned skin, still sweat-stained, hangs off the bones of his severe face, and only sparse grayed sidelocks remain at his temples. He can't treat greedy little worm bastard, so true. He can't keep track of how many times he takes to his bed through the course of a year. It wasn't only Liu's health that suffered. His assets also entered a rapid decline, and the 300 mua fields by the city walls that he'd once owned passed largely to others. Liu himself has been forced to take up a spade with unpracticed hands as one miserable day follows another. Why had his health suffered? I feel like I've got a worm at this point, what the heck? Why had his health suffered since that moment? Why did his fortune decline? Anyone who saw a connection between his spitting out the liquor worm and his ruin would naturally want to know. These questions circulated among people of all occupations in Chongshan, who offered up a variety of answers. The three I'll provide here are simply the most common conjectures. The first answer was that the liquor worm wasn't Liu's sickness, but actually his luck. He'd happened to meet an imbecile foreign priest and blithely renounced this heaven-sent blessing. The second was that the liquor worm was Liu's sickness and not his luck. It must have been because it wasn't normal to drain a great pot of liquor by oneself. If he hadn't expelled the creature, he'd surely have died long since. As such, Liu was actually fortunate to have become both poor and sick. Alright, whoever says that, I think is just kind of stupid for that. Like, yeah, it probably was that, but like, what do you mean he's fortunate to become both poor and sick? I mean, I guess it's better than death in that case, but alright. The third was that the liquor worm was neither Liu's sickness nor his luck. He'd always drunk prodigiously, and without this pastime, there was nothing left in his life. In this sense, Liu was the liquor worm, and the liquor worm was him. Letting the liquor worm out of his body was like killing himself. Since sobriety had been forced on him, he was no longer Liu. And if Liu no longer existed, it was only natural that his health and assets of old should vanish with him. I myself don't know which of the explanations is closest to the mark. In lining up these ethical judgments at the end of the tale, I merely follow the didactism of Chinese authors. He's fortunate. Yeah, I figured that out after rereading the line before. Definitely an interesting tale, and it's reminding me of... God, I know Fletch would remember this maybe, but when the Anamna Worm stuff in the Honglu Canto first came up, I really wanted to see more about worms and stuff like that in, like, sort of Asian mythologies. And one of them was, there was, like, 3 or 4 worms in a person's body, and they all represented something bad. And this liquor worm kind of brings me back to that, because one of them was like a sickness worm or something, but later they became like, some of them were seen in positive lights, some were seen in even worse lights. It's crazy. But man, is this the worst case of sobriety. What am I at? I'm at an hour. So, you know, I technically could stop here after just 3 stories. But that's no fun. Let's keep going. Just gotta lick my lips a little, because, man, mine are so useless right now. Also, hope you're enjoying all these stories, Matt. You're the only one here at the moment. It's fascinatingly not far off from analysis of alcoholics in general, in reference to how alcoholics who try to quit cold turkey, or who are at a critically low point of being terminal that they shouldn't quit. Yeah. It is always very fascinating how all these old tales come up and basically are just ancient descriptions of things we later see. So it's just stuff that they knew but couldn't really express, or just expressed it in a different way than we do. Whereas we use science and stuff, they sometimes might close the gaps off with just strange beings or phenomena. Because without the alcohol at that point, their body shuts down from withdrawal, and doctors go so far as to prescribe terminal alcoholics to drink. I feel like I've heard of that. But man, Sun did not have a single care in the world other than seeing this worm. Anyways, on to the next story. Sweet Yam Soup, and we're back to just no chapters. This happened in the 9th century, around the end of the Gangyo era, or at the start of the Nina era. Yo, sick worm, dude, so true. Although whichever it was, it isn't really important to the story. Well, thanks for telling me then that, I guess. The reader should just think of it as taking place way back in the time of the Heian court. Among the samurai serving the regent Fujiwara no Mototsune, there was one of the 5th rank. I'd like to tell you what his name was and his other circumstances, but unfortunately these don't appear in the ancient records. He was probably so unremarkable it wasn't worth mentioning. Those old writers didn't have much interest in humdrum people and events. In this respect, they're completely different from the writers of Japan's naturalist school. Thanks for the comments, either Ryunosuke or Richard Medhurst. The fiction writers of the Han era were busier than you might think. Anyway, there was this 5th rank samurai among those serving the regent Fujiwara no Mototsune, and he's the subject of this story. We spent 2 paragraphs just talking about this guy who's not important, but might have served this other guy. Thanks. 5th wasn't much to look at. He was short with a red nose and eyes that drooped down at the corners. His mustache was thin, and his hollow cheeks made his jaw seem narrower than was normal. His lips, but there's no time to spell it all out to the last detail, he just looked incredibly inferior. Ryunosuke, I want to just hit you for this entire opening. Like, come on. Man, this guy's completely worthless. I'm just not even gonna describe him. Nobody knew when or how he'd come to serve the regent, but it was true that for quite some time he'd performed the same kind of duties day after day without tiring, in the same faded robe and wilting black cap. Maybe this was why nobody who saw him could imagine that he'd ever been young. 5th was over 40 years old. every single comment of this is just knocking this guy down. What the heck? It seemed like he'd just blown in with his cold-looking red nose and paltry mustache by some passing wind on Suzaku Avenue. Heck yeah, we came back here. From Mototsune to the lowest cowherd boy, everyone believed this without really thinking about it. Looking the way he did, there's no need to write about how he was treated by those. My god, this guy is. What the heck? Man, this guy just sucks. There's just nothing good about him. No records. We shouldn't even describe how people treated him because he's just that bad. The men in the samurai guardroom paid no more attention to him than that to a fly. He had almost 20 subordinates, with or without rank, but even they were largely indifferent to his comings and goings. If Fifth addressed them, they didn't stop their chatting. Like the air around them, he never caught their eye. Like, honestly, yeah, like, why... Honestly, no clue why I'm writing this story even about him. Like, come on, it just... No one cares about him, and it's just like... yeah, I'm just not even gonna describe him. Everyone hates it. He's just Chris at this point. Everybody hates Chris, after all. As for the steward, guardroom head, and other superiors, it was only natural that they paid him no attention either. They hid a petty, childish ill will toward Fifth behind his aloof expressions, communicating with him only in gestures. Oh great, now they're Dark Souls emoting on him. Now people have language for a reason. So sometimes gestures were insufficient to communicate, but when this happened, they ascribed it to a deficiency in Fifth's understanding. Where am I? If unsatisfied, they'd look him up and down from his crooked cap to the bottoms of his ragged straw sandals, and then snicker through their noses and turn away. But Fifth never got angry. He was so spineless that he never recognized injustice. Every time I just look up and see that comment, it's just sending me back to just all my thoughts in this entire opening. His fellow samurai were always ready to make fun of him. The older ones took his unprepossessing appearance as material for their venerable quips, while the younger men used it for their own questionable witticisms. They never tired of making judgments in front of him about his nose, mustache, cap, and robe, and that wasn't all. They kept discussing his wife, with the underbite he'd split from 5 or 6 years previously, and the drunken priest she'd had an affair with. And they'd play some loathsome tricks on him, which I can't list off here one by one. My god. Like, this guy's life is just on a downward spiral the more I read. Like, his nose, mustache, cap, robe, all made fun of. His wife left with a priest, apparently. He also, it doesn't even get a name. He's just Fifth. He's just a number. But if I mention that they'd empty his bamboo sake vessel and refill it with urine, you can probably imagine their other mischief. What the heck? Good god, these samurai are just complete jerks to Fifth. What the heck? Fifth, however, was completely oblivious to this ridicule. Or so it appeared to onlookers. Whatever others said, his expression never changed. Stroking that thin mustache of his in silence, he'd just get on with whatever he had to do. Dude, this guy's life sucks. I plead the Fifth. Hashtag I plead the Fifth. Where am I? I'm laughing too much at how much life hates this guy. Whatever others said, his expression never changed. Stroking that thin mustache of his in silence, he'd just get on with whatever he had to do. But when their pranks got out of hand and they attached scraps of paper to his topknot or tied straw sandals to his scabbard, he'd smile in a way that made it hard to tell if he was going to laugh or break into tears and say, "You fellows, you're too much." Yeah, that's what he's gonna say, clearly. With that expression and voice, he appeared so pathetic to them all. It felt for a moment that it wasn't only the red-nosed fifth they were bullying, but that a whole crowd of strangers was borrowing his face and voice to criticize their heartlessness. For most of them, the feeling didn't linger. One exception was a samurai without rank from the province of Tanba, a youth whose soft mustache had only just sprouted beneath his nose. Oh good, they can be mustache buddies. Naturally, at first, he'd looked down on Fifth for no reason, like all the others. But one time, when he heard that phrase, "You fellows, you're too much," it refused to leave his head, and from that moment, Fifth appeared utterly transformed to him. In the undernourished, pallid, half-witted face, he saw a man driven by the persecution of society to the point of tears. Every time the samurai thought of Fifth, everything in the world displayed its essential inferiority. At the same time, the frostbitten nose and meager mustache gave him a kind of solace. But that was only one man. Otherwise, Fifth had to live the same dog's life, bathed in contempt. He didn't have any proper clothing to speak of. Although he had bluish-gray robe and pleated trousers, they were now so faded that they could neither be described as indigo or navy. The shoulders of the robe had dropped a little, the belt's cord and braided knots had turned an unfortunate color, and the hems of the trousers were terribly ragged. If you saw his thin, bare shins sticking out of the trousers, you wouldn't have to be one of the sharp-tongued comrades to feel it a miserable sight, like an underfell ox pulling a skinny noble's carriage. Where am I? There it is. His sword was also a suspect item with dubious metal fittings on the hilt and lacquer peeling off the black scabbard. He walked with his mincing steps, dragging his sandals and hunching in the cold, his red-nosed face looking hungrily from side to side. It was no wonder even passing peddlers mocked him. Then there was the following incident. One day, Fifth was walking from Sanjo Lane to the Shinsenen garden when he saw 6 or 7 children gathered on the side of the road. He thought they might be playing with spinning tops, but when he looked over from behind them, he found that they tied a rope around a shaggy dog they must have found wandering past, and they were flogging. My God, this world is cruel. Fifth's timidity meant that even if he'd feel sympathy for others, he'd never acted on it until now. However, he felt braver when faced with children. You mean Japan? Yeah, Japan is so cruel in this Heian period. But also, what the heck do you mean? Yeah, he feels so much braver than children. Cruelty in Japan. However, he felt braver when faced with children. Doing his best to grin, he tapped the shoulder of what seemed to be the oldest child and said, "Why don't you leave it be? You're hurting it." The child stared up at Fifth with contempt. It was the same expression used by the guardroom head when Fifth didn't catch his mating. Just kill the child. Become Anakin. "Keep out of our business," sneered the child, stepping back. "Who's this red nose?" Fifth felt the words like a blow to the face, but not because he was insulted or angry. He was miserable that he'd shamed himself by not keeping his mouth shut. Covering his embarrassment with a pained smile, he continued to walk to the garden in silence. The children stood shoulder to shoulder behind him, pulling down their lower eyelids and sticking out their tongues. He knew nothing of this, and spineless as he was, he wouldn't have done anything if he had. Was... Okay, Ryunosuke, you cannot write the following sentence after saying this man was so unimportant that he didn't even have a name. Was our hero born only to meet contempt, to live a life devoid of all hope? Not at all. For 5 or 6 years, Fifth had been fixated on sweet yam soup. This was a dish made with wild yams cut into pieces and boiled with syrup from arrowroot vines. The dish was considered to have the finest of flavors, fit to grace even the emperor's table. As such, a fellow like Fifth only had the chance to eat it once a year, as a special guest at the regent's New Year party. Even then, he was only served a tiny amount, just enough to wet his throat. For some time, his sole desire had been to sate his appetite for yam soup. Of course, he'd never tell anyone. He hadn't even clearly realized himself that it was the one wish of his life. But actually, it was probably all he was living for. People sometimes devote their whole existence to desires that may or may not be fulfilled. Those who laugh at such folly are only bystanders on the road of life. However, Fifth's dream of eating so much yam soup that he'd tire of it was surprisingly easily achieved. And then we get triple star to break up the page. On the second day of a particular new year, Mototsune held a party for special guests at his mansion. This was held by the regent on the same day as the banquet for the crown prince and empress, to which the high officials were invited, and it was otherwise not much different. Fifth mixed with the other samurai who partook of the leftovers. At that time, there was no custom of throwing leftovers out to feed the destitute. It was a feast, but this was long ago, so while there was plenty of variety, there was nothing particularly remarkable. They had 2 kinds of rice cake, steamed abalone, dried poultry, whitebait from Uji, crucian carp from Lake Biwa, dried strips of sea bream, salmon with the Roman side, grilled octopus, lobster, tachibana oranges, other citrus fruits of all sizes, and persimmons on skewers. Then there was sweet yam soup, and my page is not wanting to be turned, which Fifth looked forward to every year. Even though there were always so many people, he only ever got a little of it. This year, the portions were particularly scanty, and it might have been his imagination, but the soup seemed more delicious than usual. Staring at his empty bowl, he wiped the drops sticking to the thin mustache and commented to nobody in particular, If I could eat only one day, eat enough to tire of this. I hear that your good self has never eaten enough yam soup to tire of it, someone laughed. It was a warrior's voice, ripe and placid. Fifth's timid observation of the speaker from where he was hunched revealed it was Fujiwara no Toshihito, who was also a faithful servant of Mototsune and the son of Minister of Popular Affairs Tokunaga. A broad-shouldered man, built like a giant, he was munching boiled chestnuts and swigging down black sake. He was already very drunk. How unfortunate, Toshihito said, regarding Fifth's upturned face. He continued with a mixture of contempt and pity. If you want, I can arrange it for you. A dog that's constantly ill-treated will hesitate to approach, even if it's offered meat. With his usual expression, poised on the verge of tears or laughter, Fifth spent equal time contemplating Toshihito's face and his empty bowl. Well then, Toshihito said to break the silence, how about it? More silence followed. Fifth felt everyone's eyes on him. His reply might invite more general ridicule. Perhaps he'd be mocked no matter what he said. He hesitated. If Toshihito hadn't shown some irritation in the words, "If you don't want to, I won't force it," Fifth might have gone on comparing the bowl and the other man forever. No, I would be indebted, Fifth hastily replied. All the listeners burst into laughter, and some even mimicked him. Above the plates and serving tables, heaped with yellow and orange citrus fruits, a sea of black caps shook with merriment. The loudest and most cheerful laughter came from Toshihito himself. Then let me invite you, he frowned for a moment as the mirth rising within him met the sake he'd just downed. That is indeed satisfactory, then. I would be indebted. Blushing, Fifth stuttered his previous answer, which, needless to say, roused further hilarity. Having got Fifth to repeat himself, Toshihito's broad shoulders shook from his great guffaws. This northern rustic had learned only two ways of living, to drink and to laugh. Fortunately, the focus of conversation soon shifted away from the pair. Maybe the others found it objectionable to have the red-nosed Fifth at the center of things, even as a target of mockery. The talk jumped from topic to topic, and just as the sake and dishes were running low, general interest focused on the story of a particular samurai student who had thrust both his legs into one leg of his fur chaps while preparing to mount his horse. But Fifth heard none of this, as though the words "sweet yam soup" had taken complete control of his thought processes. Even with roasted pheasant in front of him, he didn't move his chopsticks. He didn't bring his cup of black sake to his lips. He just sat with his hands on his knees, like a girl at a matchmaking meeting, blushing to his snowy sidelocks and staring at his empty bowl with a foolish grin on his face. The morning of a few days later, two mountain men made quiet progress along the road to Awataguchi beside the Kamo River. One had a thick black beard and fine sidelocks. He wore an indigo hunting robe and trousers and carried a sword embossed with gold and silver. The other was a samurai around 40, in a shabby bluish-gray robe over thin cotton garments with a sloppily tied belt and a red dripping nose. Alright, so that's Fifth. Everything about him was tatty. Meanwhile, their 3-year-old steeds, a rose-gray roan in front and a dapple gray behind, were so fine as to turn the heads of passing peddlers and samurai. A porter and a general servant followed on foot, trying to keep up with the horse's progress. I need hardly say that this was Toshihito and Fifth's party. Although winter, it was a fine, still day. Beside the murmuring water, there was not even the hint of a breeze to shake the leaves of mugwort withered on their stalks between faded white stones. The low willows facing the river trapped sunlight in their bare branches like caramel, and the shaking of the wagtail's tail feathers in the treetops cast vivid shadows on the path. The frost-bitten velvet shoulder of a mountain that protruded over the dark green of the eastern hills was probably Mount Hiei. On their glistening mother-of-pearl saddles, the two riders spared the crop, making a leisurely pace toward Awataguchi. "Where is it that you said you were taking me?" Fifth asked, gripping the reins with unpracticed hands. "It's just ahead, not far enough for you to worry about. Is it around Awataguchi? Better if you think like that for the moment." Toshihito had invited Fifth that morning on a trip to a hot spring near the eastern hills. Fifth believed him. He hadn't been to a hot spring in ages, and his skin felt itchy all over. First yam soup and then a steaming bath would be unexpected bliss. So he mounted the dapple-gray steed provided by Toshihito. Yet, having come so far together, it seemed the other samurai wasn't planning on stopping. In fact, they'd just passed Awataguchi. "It's not at Awataguchi. It's a little more this way." Toshihito smiled without meeting Fifth's eyes as he trotted forward. The houses on both sides grew fewer in number, and crows hunted for food over the wide winter fields. Snow still visible in the shadow of the hills was dimly blue. The sight of thorny sumac treetops stabbing upward into the clear sky somehow made Fifth shudder. Then somewhere around Yamashina. "This is Yamashina here. It's a little further on." It was all true that they were passing through Yamashina, and that wasn't all. They also passed Sekiyama and arrived shortly after noon outside Midera Temple, where one of the priests was good friends with Toshihito and provided them with lunch. After that, they mounted again and hurried on. There were considerably fewer roadside houses from this point, and it was a time of rampant banditry. Fifth crouched lower than usual and looked up to ask Toshihito, "Do we have much further to go?" Toshihito grinned like a child caught out in a mischief by an elder. The wrinkles approaching the tip of his nose and the sagging muscles at the corners of his eyes twitched a little, as though he was on the brink of laughter. Finally, he said, "I thought I would bring you to Suruga." He lifted his crop and pointed toward the distant sky over Lake Biwa, which sparkled in the afternoon sun. Panicked, Fifth babbled, "You mean Suruga in Echizen?" In Echizen? He'd heard that Toshihito lived mainly in Suruga since becoming the son-in-law of Fujiwara no Arihito, but he'd never imagined that the other samurai would want to drag him all that way. For one thing, journeying over multiple hills and rivers to Echizen with a party of just 2 servants was a perilous undertaking. There were endless stories about bandits slaughtering passing travelers. "It's preposterous," said Fifth, looking at Toshihito imploringly. "You think it'll be the Eastern Hills, and it's Yamashina. Have it in your head that it's Yamashina, and it's Midera. And what can it mean if, in the end, you're going to Suruga and Echizen? If you'd said that from the start, I'd have brought some servants. Suruga is preposterous." If the thought of tiring of Yam Soup hadn't propped up his courage, Fifth would probably have turned back to Kyoto alone. Toshihito grimaced and sneered at Fifth's consternation. "You have me, Toshihito, with you. Think of me as 1,000 men. There's no cause for concern on the road." Then he called his porter over, took a quiver onto his back, and laid a black lacquered bow across his saddle as he brought his horse forward to take the lead. The cowardly Fifth could only submit to Toshihito's will. Forlorn, he gazed at the desolate wilderness around them and mouthed the half-remembered Canon Sutra in an endless cycle. His head hung down so his red nose rubbed against the swell of the saddle as his horse continued to trudge uncertainly forward. Do it for her, covered in Yam Soup photos. So true. Man's doing Brokeback Mountain with Toshihito, and it's all just for Yam Soup. Horseshoes echoed around the fields of dried yellow grass. The blue sky of this winter afternoon was reflected in occasional chilly puddles that looked as though they would freeze later. In the distance, a mountain range was dark purple along its length, without any light from lingering snow, perhaps because the sun was at its back. But desolate clumps of withered pampas grass frequently hid the view from the 2 servants who walked alongside beside the horses. Toshihito suddenly spoke. "A faithful messenger has arrived. I'll pass on a message to Suruga." Baffled, Fifth looked warily to where Toshihito was pointing with his bow. There was no sign of any other people, but among wild grapevines twined around a group of bushes, a fox was creeping forward, the warm colors of its fur exposed to the setting sun. Just then, it made a hurried leap and sprinted off at top speed. This was because Toshihito had cracked his whip, urging his horses forward toward it. Fifth forgot himself and chased after Toshihito, and the 2 servants rushed after them. The clashing of horseshoes against stones broke the silence of the plain until Toshihito brought his steed to a halt. The fox was lying upside down across his saddle, its 2 rear paws bound together. He must have harried the beast until it could run no more, and then snatched it from beneath his steed. Fifth wiped the sweat from his mustache as he finally caught up. "Listen here, Fox." Toshihito adopted a solemn tone as he hoisted the creature up before his eyes. "Go to Toshihito's mansion in Suruga and tell him Toshihito's coming right away with a guest. Send men to the area around Takashima to meet them late tomorrow morning, around the hour of the snake, and bring 2 saddled horses with you. Don't forget now." As he finished speaking, Toshihito flung the fox with one swing of his arm into the grass. Jeez. Look at him go. Having caught up, the 2 servants clapped and cheered as they watched the fox flee. Its back the color of fallen leaves, the beast sped away under the setting sun, oblivious to stones or the roots of trees. From where the party was standing, they could see it perfectly, almost as though they could touch it. During the chase, they'd ended up at a place where the plain sloped gently down to a dried-up riverbed. A fine messenger, Fifth looked up with naive respect and admiration for the wild warrior who could even bring a fox under his command. That dude's crazy. So true. He didn't have time to consider the gulf between himself and Toshihiro. He was just reassured at the other's great sphere of control, which encircled his own will. This is when adulation probably comes most easily. If the reader finds something of the sycophant and the red-nosed Fifth from this point, it's no reason to doubt his character. The freed fox dashed down the slope as if it was rolling and sprang dexterously between the stones on the waterless riverbed before racing up the opposite incline. It glanced back as it climbed to see its captor samurai with his retinue and horses, as small as the fingers on one hand. The rose-gray roan and the dapple-gray stood out in the frosty air, bathed in the setting sun. How much more of this story is there? It feels like it's just been going on. Especially when the beginning of it was just this guy sucks. And now we have Toshihiro who's just like insane. The fox turned its head forward again and sped like the wind through the withered pampas grass. And then another triple star time break. The party arrived at Takashima. Why are we back in Takashima? The party arrived at Takashima the next day at the hour of the snake as planned. This was a peaceful village with a view. Oh no, this was where they were going. 18 more pages of Fifth getting bullied. God. This was a peaceful village with a view of Lake Biwa. Unlike the previous day, the sky was overcast above a few scattered straw-thatched dwellings. Between the pines growing at the shore, wintry gray ripples could be seen spreading across the water, which was like an unpolished mirror. Here, Toshihiro turned back to Fifth. "Look, the men have come to meet us," he said. Indeed, some 20 or 30 men had come either mounted or on foot, bringing 2 saddled horses. The sleeves of their robes fluttering in the wind, they hurried toward Toshihiro's group among the pine trees of the lakeside. When they came close, those on horseback hastily dismounted, while those on foot crouched at the side of the path to wait in reverence for their lord. That fox really did what you told him. It's a shapeshifter by nature, so that kind of job was nothing at all. Toshihiro casually making a kitsune bend to his will. Alright, sure. During this exchange, Toshihiro's party reached the waiting men. "Thank you for your efforts," he called to them. The crouching men scrambled to their feet and took the 2 men's horses by the bridles. Soon there was an atmosphere of good cheer. "A curious thing happened last night," a gray-haired man in a brown robe said, after Toshihiro and Fifth had dismounted and sat down on furs. God, I wish I was maybe with a wolf girl instead. Honestly, I would bend to Toshihiro's will after all of this that he's doing for this random guy. "What was that?" Toshihiro asked, unruffled. He offered Fifth the sake and lunchboxes brought by his men. "It was like this. Yesterday evening, around the hour of the dog, my lady suddenly lost consciousness. 'I am a fox from Sakamoto,' she said. 'Come closer and I will tell you what my lord said today.' When everyone gathered around, she spoke. 'My lord's coming at once with a guest. Send men to the area around Takashima to meet them late tomorrow morning, around the hour of the snake, and bring 2 saddled horses with you.' 'That's certainly mysterious,' Toshihiro said. Fifth scrutinized the faces of Toshihiro and his retainer, while making enough noises of interest to satisfy them both. That wasn't all. She was trembling with terror and crying constantly, and she said, 'Don't be late. If you're late, my lord will disown me.' And what happened next? She went into a faint. When we came out to meet you, she was yet to regain her senses." "What do you make of that?" Toshihiro asked Fifth in self-satisfaction. "I, Toshihiro, can control the beasts." Jeez. I'm filled with wonder. Fifth rubbed his nose, lowered his head, and opened his mouth in a theatrical show of shock. Drops of the sake that he'd just been drinking clung to his mustache. And then another triple star break. Fifth spent that night in a room in Toshihiro's mansion, vacantly staring at the lamplight, unable to sleep. Images of that evening appeared in his mind, one after the other. Toshihiro and his retainers laughing and chatting, hills of pines, streams, dried up fields, grass, leaves, stones, the smell of smoke from wildfires. He realized his relief at their arrival, when under a sparrow-colored dusk haze, they'd finally seen the red flames of charcoal fires in their long boxes. From where he was lying now, this seemed like an event of the distant past. He stretched his legs out under the thickly paddled yellow robe they had given him to wear and considered his own recumbent form. Beneath the padded robe, he wore two thick ivory-colored cotton robes. This alone was enough that he was almost sweating. The cup of sake he'd had with dinner also lent its assistance. Possible ban evader, more like just a whorebot account again. On the other side of the shutter, next to where he lay, there was a garden of frost, but that didn't matter to him in his pleasantly tipsy state. All was entirely different from his room in Kyoto. Even so, Fifth felt a disproportionate sense of anxiety. For one thing, time passed so slowly, and yet he didn't want the passing of the night and subsequent eating of yam soup to come too promptly. In addition to the warring of these contradictory emotions, his unease at the sudden change of circumstances felt as chilly as the weather. With these intrusive sentiments, even the warmth of the room did not lead easily to sleep. Then he heard a loud voice in the garden outside. The gray-haired retainer who'd come out to meet them that day seemed to be making a proclamation. Maybe his dried-up voice was echoing off the frost, because each word penetrated Fifth's bones like a biting winter wind. All you servants, listen to me. By the hour of the rabbit tomorrow morning, our Lord wishes you to each bring a good-sized yam, 3 inches wide, when cut open, and 5 feet long. Don't forget, by the hour of the rabbit. This was repeated 2 or 3 times, before the noise of people ceased and the space returned to the former peace of a winter night. The lamp oil cracked amid the quiet. Flames flickered like red cotton. Fifth swallowed a single yawn and lapsed into his rambling thoughts again. If they were collecting wild yams, it must be for yam soup. With this conclusion, he felt the return of the unease that he'd forgotten while distracted by what was happening outside. He felt more than ever that he didn't want to get the soup too quickly, and this thought remained obstinately at the center of his mind. If he was so soon to tire of eating the dish without any effort of his own, his patience over so many years seemed a dreadful waste. He wanted some obstacle to prevent him from getting the yam soup, and then for that obstacle to be removed so he could eat it at last. With such thoughts spinning like tops inside him, Fifth, exhausted from his journey, fell into a deep sleep. Aw, poor guy. The night's incident with the wild yams nagged at him as soon as he woke the next morning, so he hurried to open the shutter. He realized he'd slept in, and it was already past the hour of the rabbit. What looked like 2,000 or 3,000 logs were laid out in the garden on long mats, piled up in mountains that reached as high as the slanting cypress bark roof. He realized then that these were the huge yams the gray-haired retainer had ordered. Fifth rubbed his bleary eyes and looked around dumbfounded, in a state close to panic. In the courtyard, 5 or 6 giant pots sat on top of what appeared to be of freshly hammered steaks, with dozens of young female servants in white garments moving around them. All were making dizzying efforts to prepare yam soup. Some stoked the fires or raked the ashes, while others filled with white wooden pails with vine syrup and added them to pots. The smoke rising from beneath these vessels mixed with the steam rising from within them and with the lingering dawn haze, so it was difficult to discern anything at all clearly in the courtyard. Amid the gray, only the red flames heating the pots were visible, and the commotion was like that of a battlefield or the scene of a conflagration. Fifth thought about the mountains of yams that would become soup in the oversized pots. Then he pondered how he'd been brought all the way from Kyoto to Suruga to eat this very yam soup. The more he thought about it, the more miserable he became. Our Fifth's appetite had already halved. 2 hours later, Fifth sat down to breakfast with Toshihito and his father-in-law Arihito. In front of him, there was a huge silver kettle, brimful of what looked like an ocean of yam soup. He'd seen dozens of young men slicing the yams previously piled as high as the roof with dexterous movements of their thin blades. He'd then observed the servant women dashing about scooping all the slices into pots, and at last, when not a single vegetable remained on any of the mats, he'd watched several columns of steams, fragrant with yam and vine syrup, rising as haze into the bright morning sky. And so I pray unlimited yam works. So true. It was perhaps unsurprising that he already felt satiated, although he had yet to sup of the soup in the kettle. The unfortunate fellow wiped his forehead. "You've never eaten your fill of yam soup. Don't hesitate now," said Arihito, who then called the pages to place more silver kettles on the table, all of which were slopping with soup. Fifth shut his eyes, his red nose redder than ever, and scooped half of one kettle's contents into a large earthenware bowl before grimly gulping it down. "Listen to father, don't stand on ceremony," Toshihito said with a wicked grin as he offered a fresh kettle. Fifth was at a loss. He wasn't holding back at all. From the start, he hadn't wanted a single bowl of yam soup, but he'd forced himself to finish half a kettle. If he tried eating any more, he was sure it would come straight back up, but if he didn't, he'd lose Toshihito and Arihito's goodwill. So he squeezed his eyes shut again and swallowed about a third of the half that remained. After that, there was no way he could manage another drop. "Thank you so much. I'm indebted. I've eaten enough. Indeed, I'm indebted," Fifth faltered. He was now so undone that beads of sweat were dripping from his mustache and nose, as though it wasn't winter at all. "But you've hardly had more than a mouthful. Our guest is being too bashful. Hey, you there, don't stand around idly." The page addressed by Arihito followed his instructions and made to serve yam soup from a fresh vessel into Fifth's earthenware bowl. Fifth shook his hands around as if he was trying to catch a fly, in his efforts to indicate that he certainly didn't want any more. "I've really had enough. I'm afraid to say it, but I've really had enough." If Toshihito hadn't suddenly pointed at the eaves of the house opposite with the words, "Look at that," Arihito might never have ceased his insistence that Fifth eat more soup. It was fortunate that his voice drew everyone's attention. Just then, the morning sun struck the hour's cypress bark roof. Dazzling light washed over the glossy fur of the beast that was sitting there peacefully. This was the fox from Sakamoto that Toshihito had captured the day before by the withered fields. "The fox wants some soup too. Men, make sure it gets its wish." Toshihito's order was carried out immediately. The fox came down from the roof and it was fed in the courtyard. Watching the animal lap up its food, Fifth reminisced on the man he'd been before coming to this place. The man mocked by so many samurai. The man who'd even been addressed by a Kyoto child with the words, "Who's this red nose?" The lonely, pitiful man with a faded robe and pleated trousers who wandered Suzaku Avenue like a stray dog. But also the happy man who, by his efforts alone, had held on to the desire to eat his fill of yam soup. Relieved at his reprieve from swallowing any more, he felt the sweat across his whole face begin to dry from the tip of his nose. Despite the brightness of the Suruga morning, a bitter wind was blowing. Fifth rushed to hold his nose as a sneeze exploded from it in the direction of the silver kettles. And yep, that's the end of it. We get the most comedy ending ever after the most painful introduction ever of, man, this guy just sucks. What the heck, Akutagawa? What even was that story? Oh boy. Honestly, I wasn't expecting Shakespearean comedy to be in this, but what it is what it is. So it wasn't the soup that was important, but the dream of the soup. Yep, exactly. And that was why he had started feeling so miserable, because he'd finally been reaching that dream without so much effort. In fact, the only reason he got there was all because of Toshihito and his insistence that he bring him to Suruga. Which, honestly, that is a completely understandable feeling. I know it very well, especially when you buy me stuff. Where it's the feeling of just, you know, not really deserving it because you didn't... It feels like you didn't work for it. It was clearly just fucking with him and making it so true, honestly. But at the same time, like, that... Toshihito still was, like, the only decent guy at the end of it. Everyone else was just such a jerk to him. See, it's different, I think, because to some extent, like, yeah, I get that. Honestly, though, the comedy ending really does tie everything together. It's just, yep, he's finally made it, he's had his fill, and then all the soup is destroyed because of his sneezing. Because of his red nose. But ultimately, he wasn't doing it out of wanting to make him happy. He was still doing it to rile him up and make a spectacle for himself. Yeah, that's fair. God, Toshihito was just crazy, though, for just capturing a fox / kitsune and making it his messenger. Like, what the heck? Man is just built differently. Meanwhile, I'll buy you a game because I just want you to be happy. Okay, what time is it? 12:46? Okay. I think I can do one more story. Because honestly, part of me's getting tired, but I still actually do want to keep reading these because they're just so fascinating. They're so strange when it's just jumping from one to another. Like, at first we have like a moral story about what people will do in times and how really is it evil to say when it comes between needing to survive and just wanting to be a good person and die, to whatever the heck this story of suffering and comedy was. So, we will end this off with one last story. The Devil and Tobacco. Tobacco isn't native to Japan. It was imported at some stage, but the records disagree as to when. Some say it was around the start of the 17th century, while others hold it was in the middle of the 16th century. Yet, by about 1605, it was already being cultivated all over the country. Dare, it's so true. Not long after, a satirical poem listing ineffective things includes tobacco bans alongside bad money laws, the emperor's words, and arrogant doctors, demonstrating how common smoking had become. As to who imported the plant, historians agree that it was either the Portuguese or Spanish. Legend, however, provides another answer, saying that the devil himself was responsible, and it was the Christian padres, probably Francis Xavier himself, who carried the devil all the way to Japan. Great, first the devil went down to Georgia, now it's going over to Japan to bring tobacco. What won't this guy do? Some Christians may accuse me of slandering their priests, But it's a fact. It's only natural that the foreign devil came from the foreign god, just as Western evils are imported together with Western virtues. Although I can't affirm who brought tobacco in, Anatole France describes how the devil once tried tempting a priest with mignonette flowers. As such, we can't dismiss the idea that the devil bringing tobacco to Japan as an outright falsehood. And even if it is a lie, it may be in some sense curiously close to the truth. Such thoughts lead me to recount the legend that follows. Okay, so these... Yeah, new translations and introduction by Richard Medhurst. Okay, so some of these might just be Richard Medhurst talking. Because I feel like Greenowski... I don't know, this first thing just feels more like a Westerner talking. In 1549, the devil made safe landing in Japan after a lengthy sea voyage, having transformed himself into one of the lay brothers accompanying Francis Xavier. Gemine viewers. Wait, what the heck? Peter Biggle. Hey man, happy weekend. I want to support your journey and help expand your channel by connecting you with a Twitch streamer who's got 3.1. It can assist you in gaining Gemine followers. Incredible. One connection can truly make a difference. It really can. Thank you for following me, Peter, but I don't think I will, honestly. I think I'm fine where I'm at the moment. And yeah, I can't believe I can get Gemini viewers. The actual brother whose form he took on was left behind on Macau or somewhere unaware that his party's black ship had left harbor. The devil, who'd passed the time until the vessel departed hanging upside down, with his tail coiled around the mast and spying on the happenings on board, immediately metamorphosed into the brother and began serving Xavier morning and night. Compared to the time when he appeared to Dr. Faust as a splendid nobleman cloaked in red, this was an effortless illusion. Yo, let's go, we finally got our first Limbus reference. The devil discovered Japan to be quite unlike its description in Marco Polo's account, which he'd read in Europe. First of all, that book claimed the country overflowed with gold in every corner, but such riches were nowhere to be found. If that were true, he'd only have to scratch his nail against a pebble to turn it into gold, and that would make for an effective temptation. Polo also lied when he said that the Japanese could resurrect the dead through the power of pearls or some such substance. If there were no marvelous cures, the devil could spread the plague by spitting in wells and distract believers' hearts from the joys of the Christian paradise to come amid their suffering. While following Saint Francis Xavier around and looking appropriately solemn as they observed the new country, he plotted and smirked to himself in satisfaction. However, there was one nagging problem even the devil could do nothing about. As Francis Xavier had only just arrived in Japan and had not yet had time for such proselytizing, there were no Christians, and thus nobody for the devil to tempt. No matter that he was the devil, it still flummoxed him. He had no idea how to pass the present period of boredom. The devil's about to just make Christians so he can tempt them at this point. After some rumination, he hit on gardening as a way of killing time. He'd been carrying various seeds in his ears since they left Europe, and it would be simple enough to get hold of land by renting it locally. Xavier was enthusiastic in agreement to the plan. Of course, he imagined that one of his lay brothers had brought Western medicinal plants to Japan. The devil rushed to obtain farming tools and began to cultivate a wayside field. One humid spring morning, a distant temple bell sleepily sounded through the lower reaches of the haze hanging in the air. It was a peaceful ringing, unlike the familiar clear tones of Western churches, with none of their irritation. But the devil was by no means at ease in this tranquil locale. The temple bells disturbed him more than the chimes of St. Paul's, and he grimaced, throwing his back into the tilling the soil. This was because the lazy tone of the bells and the faint rays of sun were starting to make him feel uncharacteristically relaxed. See, even the devil can feel good sometimes. The devil turning Lei Hang to tempt Ryoshi into drawing Araya Shiki. The devil's just on vacation in Japan, basically, at this point. He wasn't ready to do good, but he also wasn't in the mood to perform evil. Seriously, man is just on vacation. If this was how things were going to be, he'd wasted his time crossing the ocean to come and tempt the Japanese. The devil, who hated labor so much he'd once been scolded by Ivan the Fool's sister for having no calluses on his hands, now put every effort into wielding his hoe, trying to shake off his moral lethargy. Several days later, the field was plowed, and he'd plucked the seeds from his ears to plant them in the furrows. Devil Japan. Over the months, the devil's seeds began to bud and send out stems until, by the end of the summer, the whole field was covered with broad green leaves. Yet nobody knew the name of what he was growing. Even when Xavier asked, the devil only grinned in reply. The plant's abundant flowers were light purple and shaped like funnels. These blossoms delighted the devil, who'd put so much effort into growing them. After morning and evening prayers, he was sure to go to the field and devote himself to cultivation. One day, when Xavier was away on a trip to perform missionary work, a cattle merchant passed by the field leading a yellow ox. He saw, amid luxuriant purple flowers, a foreign priest wearing a black cloak and wide-brimmed hat, removing pests from the leaves. The blossoms were so unusual that the merchant stopped despite himself, removed his sedge hat, and addressed the Portuguese brother deferentially. "I beg your pardon, sir, but what flowers are those?" The false brother turned around. He looked like a good-natured European with a flat nose and small eyes. "These flowers?" "Indeed, sir." The European leaned on the fence and shook his head. Then, in still halting Japanese, he replied, "I'm terribly sorry, but I can't reveal their name." "Really? Has Xavier told you to keep it secret?" "Not at all." "Then could you inform me? I myself was recently enlightened by Francis Xavier and converted to your faith." The merchant touched his chest in satisfaction, and indeed a small brass cross around his neck glinted in the sun. Perhaps it shone too brightly, as the brother grimaced a moment and looked down before speaking more affably than ever, although whether in jest it was impossible to tell. "I still can't do it. It's a rule in my country that I'm not allowed to tell anyone. But why don't you try to guess? The Japanese are clever, so you're sure to work it out. If you guess right, I'll give you everything growing in this field." "Devil, you need to stop making deals. This is how you keep getting captured and put in things." The merchant must have thought the brother was mocking him. A smile on his lips, he tilted his sunburned face in an exaggerated show of puzzlement. "What's that you say? I'm not sure I understand." "It needn't be today. Think carefully over the next 3 days. You can ask anybody you want. If you're correct, I'll give you everything here. Some red wine, too. And would you like a picture of the Garden of Eden?" Taken aback by the other's ardor, the merchant asked, "And what if I don't guess correctly?" The brother pushed his hat back from his forehead, wagged his hand, and laughed. The merchant, too, gave an unexpectedly screeching laugh like that of a crow. "If you don't guess correctly, I'll have something from you. We'll make it a wager, based on whether you guess right or not. And if you win, I'll give you all of this." The brother had returned to his affable tone. "Very well, I will take your wager and offer anything you suggest." "You'd give me anything? Even that ox, for example?" "If that's what you want, I'll wager it now." The merchant grinned and rubbed the yellow ox's forehead. He seemed to think it was all a joke on the part of a friendly brother. "And if I win, I'll take all these plants with the flowers." "Splendid, splendid. It's agreed. Anything I suggest." "It's agreed indeed. I swear in the name of our Lord Jesus Christ." "Big mistake, buddy. Big mistake." On hearing this, the brother's small eyes shone, and he snorted 2 or 3 times in satisfaction. With his left hand on his hip and his chest thrust slightly forward, he brushed the tobacco flowers with his other hand. "And if you guess wrong, I'll receive your body and soul." With these words, he swung his right hand in a great circle and removed his hat to reveal 2 goat's horns among the tousled hair. The merchant branched and dropped his own hat to the ground. Maybe it was the shadows cast by the sun that made the flowers and leaves in the field lose their luster for a moment. Even the ox acted spooked, lowering its horns and giving a rumbling moan. A promise is a promise, even if you made it to me. You swore it on a name that I can't repeat. Don't forget. You have 3 days. Goodbye. The devil bowed to the merchant with a mocking courtesy. The merchant regretted being taken in so carelessly. He had to do something or the devil would steal his body and soul to burn in the everlasting flames of hell. There would be no point in having abandoned his former faith and received baptism in a new one. He'd sworn in Jesus Christ's name, so he couldn't break his promise. Francis Xavier might have been able to help if he was here, but unfortunately he was away. So the merchant didn't sleep for 3 days, as he considered how he might outwit the devil. The only thing to do was to learn the name of the plant. But if Xavier didn't know it, was there anyone who did? On the evening of the 3rd day, the merchant crept over close to where the false brother lived, again leading his yellow ox. The house stood next to the field, facing the road, and the brother seemed to be asleep as there wasn't any light at the window. The moon had risen, but the sky was overcast, and the purple flowers in the silent field showed faintly amid the gloom. Though doubtful, the merchant had formulated a plan. But having crept here at last, he was unnerved by the deserted scene, and part of him felt like going straight back home. He'd plucked up his courage, but beside the house he was fearful and disheartened at the thought of that gentleman with the goat horns, who was now perhaps dreaming of hell. Yet this was no time to be feeble, if he wasn't to relinquish his body and soul to the devil. With a prayer for the protection of the Virgin Mary, the merchant put his scheme into effect, although it wasn't much of a plan. Setting the yellow ox free from its halter and whacking it hard in the rump, he drove it toward the field. The ox leapt up from the pain, smashing the fence and trampling the field. Its horns drove through the wooden walls of the house several times. Bellows and the thundering of hooves echoed in all directions through the thin night mist. A figure opened the window shutters and put its face out. In the darkness, it was impossible to see who it was, but it must have been the devil in the form of the brother. Despite the gloom, the merchant was certain he saw horns. "The brute's destroying my tobacco field," yelled the devil, waving his hands about, still half asleep. Perhaps he'd been disturbed just as he was laying down to rest, as he appeared in a total fury. Like the voice of God, the devil's words came to the ears of the merchant, who'd concealed himself behind the field to observe the results of his scheme. "The brute's destroying my tobacco field." What an insane plan. Just commit property damage and hope he reveals it. As is often the case in this kind of tale, matters reached a satisfactory conclusion. The merchant outwitted the devil and informed him that the plant was called tobacco, thereby winning everything growing in the field. This devil guy isn't that bright. He really isn't. But I think there's something deeper here. Although the devil was unable to make the merchant's body and soul his own, he did popularize tobacco across all of Japan, in which case, the merchant's salvation carried with it corruption, and the devil's failure was a form of success. For the devil may stumble, but he still receives. And it's when people think they've overcome temptation that they may face unexpected defeat. In brief, the devil's subsequent movements are as follows. He was driven out with a sacred pentagram upon the return of Francis Xavier. He continued to wander, however, in the form of a lay brother. Some documents record his occasional appearances in Kyoto around the time the Christian church was built there. And some say that the magician Kashin Koji... Okay, I know Kashin Koji because I've played Fate Go. They finally came up. Who made sport with Matsunaga Hisahide by conjuring up his dead wife was actually the devil. But, as Lafcadio Hearn has written about him, I won't discuss that here. Then, when the crackdown on Christianity came under the Toyotomi and Tokugawa clans, the devil lingered at first, but in the end he vanished from Japan. The records really only cover his appearances up to this point. It's unfortunate that we can't learn anything about what he's been doing since his return to Japan after the Meiji era began in 1868. Alright, I'm definitely ending on that, because that one is even more of a comedy than the last one was. Once again, the devil is just outsmarted by a guy. Incredible. Oh boy. Sorry, doing a little stretch. But thank you so much for joining me, Matt, and also Peter Bagel, even though I know you're just advertising something. Definitely gonna do more reading streams just because random Christian parable stuck in there. It's so true. Just randomly the devil went down to Georgia-esque tale. But it is what it is. Thank you, Akutagawa, for these stories. Thank you for the stream. No problem. I don't know when I'll do the next stream, but it's probably going to be a reading one, unless Limbus is just like, here's an event, or one of the games I'm playing I just want to do randomly. Who knows? Until then, though, hope you all have a good day or night, and I'll see you all later.